Violence, which is the lecture that we missed when I had to cancel class. And in specific, what we're going to talk about is the article that was assigned to you, which was Violent Crime on American Television by Amir Hitzroni. And Hitzroni starts off the article with the note that about 3/4 of Americans think there's a relationship between violence on television and the actual crime rate. Now, that's what happens when you survey people and you say, do you think there is a relationship between the amount of violence on television and actual crime in the world? And about 3/4 of the people will say yes when they're asked that question. And that's pretty consistent across different surveys of people that we have. The problem with that is this next piece, which is a little complicated, and that's that if you look at the direct behavioral effect of prolonged exposure to violent programs, it's less than 3% of the variance and decreases below 1% when actual violence is used as an indicator. Now, take a second to write that down or however you're doing this because there's some explanation involved here. When people are doing research that tries to determine why folks are violent criminals, why they commit violent crimes, then what you do is you compare large populations of people who are criminals to large populations of people who aren't. And you say, okay, what accounts for this difference? Is it, demographics? Is it social class? Is it, people's backgrounds in terms of whether or not they were exposed to violence as children? All that kind of stuff. And different characteristics might account for different percents of, different amounts of the explanation of the difference of the variance or difference between these two populations. So what is it that where is violent television watching in terms of its influence on people? If you say what percent of the variance between actual violent criminals and people that aren't, violent, how much of that variance can be explained by the fact that the violent criminals watch a lot of TV? And the answer is actually less than 3% of that variance. And if you are talking about actual violence, like people are actually committing violence, not just, aggressive thoughts or whatever, then that variance goes down to about 1% or less. So the difference between, people that commit violent crimes and those that don't can only be explained by prolonged television watching, maybe 1% of the time. And that's only the studies that actually think there is a relationship between those two things. So there's a lot of research that says there's no difference. So it's, while 3/4 of Americans think there's this relationship, the relationship, even if it does exist, which we're not sure it does, but even if it does exist, it's less than 1% of the actual difference. Now, we are concerned about television because television drama in particular is about 53% richer in violent crime and about 10 times poorer in nonviolent property crime in particular. So television's not a accurate representation of reality. It has a lot more crime, especially a lot more violent crime, and a lot less property crime than happens in the real world. The single most overrepresented crime on TV is murder. If you look at, at television and what kind of crimes are portrayed on television, it's vastly murder over everything else. But in the real world, over 80% of actual crime is property crime, and you'll notice that you don't see that on TV very much. You don't see people's houses getting broken into and robbed. You don't see, people's bikes getting stolen. You don't see their laptops getting jacked in the library. That's not the sort of thing that we see on television. We see violent crime, and in particular, we see murder. So when we watch television, if we think that television is an accurate representation of reality, then we are thinking the world's a lot more violent than it is, and oddly, we think the world is less likely to steal your stuff than it really is. The other thing about television is that the criminals on TV tend to be older and richer than real criminals. Television drama in particular is fascinated with wealthy criminals or, upper middle class criminals and older people committing crimes when the vast majority of crimes are committed by younger people and people that are not rich. It's not that surprising, really. The other thing that's interesting about television, to me this is the most interesting part, is that female criminals are dramatically underrepresented. In other words, there's a lot of women committing crimes, but we just don't see that on television because the public tends to not think of women as criminals, even though, we've got a couple of shows that do focus on that. About 2/3 of real crimes go unsolved, but if you watch television, you'll note that nearly 2/3 of TV crimes are being solved. And when it comes to certain kinds of program, that number is even higher. If you look at cop shows, they find the bad guy all the time. People confess. They don't just get caught. They tell you why they did it. A variety of things that don't actually happen in reality. Now, there's a number of problems with the argument that watching violence on television, and violent crime in particular, causes actual violence, right? If you want to make the argument that watching TV causes TV violence or causes people to actually be violent themselves, you got a couple problems. First of all, there's no actual evidence that convicted criminals watch more violent TV than other people, and that would have to be true. Right? If watching violent television made you violent, then we'd look at people that are caught committing violent crimes, and we would see a lot more television watching, and we just don't. The appearance of popular television, back in the 50s, did not cause a spike in the violent crime rate, and in fact, there hasn't been an increase in the violent crime rate that can be related to television since then. Now, interestingly, the violent crime rate itself has been steadily going down since about 1989, even as violence on television remains high. In fact, there's a lot more television than there used to be. There's a lot more violent television than there used to be, and yet the crime rate has been going down, down, down. And in fact, right now, the crime rate in the United States, the violent crime rate, is as low as it's been since the late 60s, early 70s. And it even went down another 5.6% last year. So you'd think that if, in fact, watching violent television causes people to be violent, we'd see some kind of indication in that in the crime rate, and we just have not seen that at all. Even studies that show a link show that not all TV violence affects people the same way, and not all people are affected the same way. So for example, like cartoon violence, where the Roadrunner is essentially murdering the coyote over and over again, doesn't tend to affect people the same way as really graphic violence. And so when we talk about violence on television, we should be talking about a lot of different things instead of just one thing. Another possible outcome of watching media violence is what's called mean world syndrome. We've talked about this already a little bit, but just to remind you, it means you see the world as dangerous and people as untrustworthy, right? Because you look at the world through the lens of television and you imagine that it is full of criminals when it is really not so much. There does seem to be a connection between television viewing and mean world syndrome. We do seem to see some sort of connection there. But the interesting part about that is if you watch fictional television, you also tend to exhibit this other syndrome called just world syndrome. And just world syndrome is the belief that justice is the usual outcome of conflicts in the world. Now, if you think about it, this makes a ton of sense. Television shows us a lot more crime than really happens, especially violent crime. But it also shows us people solving those crimes, right? It shows us the police solving the crimes at a much higher rate than reality. So if you watch television and you take it as an accurate representation of the world, you would think, well, the world is, really quite violent, but it is also quite just in the sense that, the bad people will be caught. And so even though you think of the world as dangerous, you also think of the world as just, and that has an odd tendency to sort of offset your conviction that the world is mean, so to speak. In the end, the effect of violent media is small and what Hetzroni describes as more dispositional than behavioral. And what that means is violent television tends to affect our attitudes about violence a lot more than it affects what we actually do and how we actually behave. So if you give people surveys and measure their attitudes about violence, and then you show them a lot of violent television and you give them a similar survey at the end, they will end up having changed their survey answers because they will be more tolerant of violence, they will be more willing to advocate violence, but they are not actually more violent. Now, the problem with this is that politicians and the public tend to put a huge amount of attention to this very uncertain link between TV violence and actual violence. And so you'll see, the media and politicians talk about how awful violent television is, it's unbelievable, when in fact, there's really not very much of a link at all.